The charges are gone. No plea, no conviction, no explanation on the record, just a dismissal. After days of speculation following her arrest in Florida shortly after Christmas, Zeruiah appeared in court, and the outcome was not what most people expected. The battery and aggravated assault charges tied to the alleged altercation with Troy were dismissed outright. No public reasoning from the judge. No detailed explanation from the prosecution. Just gone. And that silence is what's fueling everything now. Because up until today, the situation looked volatile. According to earlier reports and police allegations, Zeruiah was accused of striking Troy in the head with a phone and allegedly chasing him with a knife. There were also claims that she contacted law enforcement and attempted to have multiple people arrested, including her own father, whom she reportedly accused of choking her. Instead of anyone else being taken into custody, she was the one arrested. That alone shifted public perception. Then came court. Many people believed one of two things would happen. Either she wouldn't show up, disappearing, skipping court, hoping the case would stall, or that extradition wouldn't follow her if warrants were issued later. Or she would show up and be taken into custody once authorities realized inconsistencies in the story, including allegations that Troy was misidentified and that false information may have been given to police. Neither happened. She appeared, she left, and the charges were dismissed. That outcome is jarring for viewers because it clashes with how serious the allegations initially sounded. Battery and aggravated assault are not minor charges. They're not traffic issues. They're the kind of charges prosecutors don't usually drop casually, at least not without a reason. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Cases get dismissed every day without public explanation. And when that happens, it usually points to one of a few procedural realities. Not innocence declared, not guilt erased, but prosecutorial feasibility. Because courts don't operate on what could have happened. They operate on what can be proven. One likely factor is witness cooperation. In cases like this, prosecutors rely heavily on testimony. If the alleged victim refuses to testify, becomes uncooperative, or contradicts earlier statements, the case weakens fast. While prosecutors can move forward without a cooperating victim, many choose not to if corroborating evidence is thin. Another factor is evidentiary sufficiency. Photos, medical reports, body cam footage, third-party witnesses. Without enough of these aligning, a case may not survive even basic scrutiny. And prosecutors are not required to explain why they drop a case unless challenged. They simply assess whether it's worth proceeding, and sometimes they decide it isn't. According to reporting credited to Starcasm, the no-contact order that had prohibited Zeruiah from communicating with Troy has also been lifted following the dismissal. That's a procedural consequence, not a moral one. When charges disappear, protective conditions often disappear with them, which means she is now legally free to resume contact and, according to speculation, return to work. This is where public frustration spikes, because from the outside, it looks like someone got away with it. But legally, that's not what a dismissal means. A dismissal means the state chose not to proceed, not that the events didn't occur, and not that the behavior was acceptable. It means the case, as it stood, could not move forward. And that distinction matters. It also explains something many people overlooked. Before Troy publicly acknowledged that he was previously known as Dale, He repeatedly told followers that the charges would be dropped. At the time, that confidence felt misplaced. Prosecutors don't usually drop cases just because an alleged victim wants them gone. But sometimes they do, especially when testimony is central and cooperation evaporates. It's also possible that neither Troy nor Zeruiah's father wanted to testify. Without willing witnesses, prosecutors are often left with conflicting statements and insufficient proof. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the system couldn't adjudicate it. Still, the emotional response is understandable. Many people wanted consequences, not out of malice, but out of concern. There were calls for mandated anger management, counseling, or court-ordered intervention. Not prison, not destruction, just something that acknowledged a pattern and tried to interrupt it. But courts don't order treatment in dismissed cases. No charge means no leverage, and that's where the disappointment sits. Because dismissals don't resolve underlying issues. They just end cases. Now zoom out. This dismissal doesn't exist in isolation. It lands inside a larger universe of updates tied to love after lockup, and that's where the whiplash intensifies. While Zeruiah walks free, another storyline just took a sharp turn. Titus's cousin Jamal, introduced early this season as the person helping install cameras so Titus could monitor Monique, is now reportedly a wanted fugitive. Jamal had previously disclosed that he'd recently been released from prison after multiple arrests related to drug trafficking and possession of criminal tools. According to information circulated by online sources, including reporting attributed to Mary Pan, Jamal has now re-entered the system, this time as someone authorities are actively seeking. The irony isn't lost on viewers. One reminder that legal outcomes aren't about fairness in the abstract. They're about timing, evidence, cooperation, and proof. And that contrast sets the tone for everything that follows. Because tonight's headline isn't just case dismissed. It's case dismissed, while another one ignites. And that's where we stop part one. Because before jumping to conclusions about who won or lost, we need to talk about what dismissals actually mean, why they happen, and why they often leave more questions than answers. And yes, we'll also start unpacking how a wanted fugitive enters the picture at the exact same moment someone else. So before we go any further with this story, we need to reset expectations and talk about what a dismissal actually resolves and what it leaves completely untouched. Because this case didn't end with a verdict. It ended with a decision not to proceed. Those are very different things. In the situation involving Zeruiah, the battery and aggravated assault charges tied to the alleged altercation with Troy were dismissed at court. No plea agreement, no trial, no findings of fact entered into the record, which means the court never ruled on whether the allegations were true or false. That's the first misconception to clear. A dismissal does not equal innocence. It also does not equal guilt avoided. It means the prosecution chose not to move forward with this case at this time under these conditions. And prosecutors make that choice for a small, repeatable set of reasons, none of which involve protecting someone because they're famous, loud, or dramatic. Let's break those reasons down. The most common reason cases like this get dismissed is witness dependency. Battery and assault cases often hinge on testimony from the alleged victim and any supporting witnesses. If the alleged victim refuses to testify, recants, becomes inconsistent, or signals they will not cooperate, the case can collapse fast. Prosecutors can legally move forward without a victim's cooperation, but only if the remaining evidence is strong enough to carry the burden. That means things like clear injuries documented by medical professionals, independent eyewitnesses, body cam footage capturing the incident, recorded admissions, physical evidence that tells the story on its own. If those elements don't exist or don't align, understanding changes. A prosecutor doesn't ask, "Did this happen?" They ask, "Can I prove this to a jury?" And if the answer is no, dismissal is not weakness. It's restraint. Another reason cases get dropped is credibility conflict. If multiple statements were made, to police, to family, to third parties, and those statements contradict each other in meaningful ways, prosecutors face a problem. Defense attorneys don't need to prove innocence. They need to introduce reasonable doubt. And inconsistent narratives do that instantly. This becomes especially fragile when accusations spread across multiple people, as they reportedly did here, with claims involving Troy, Zeruiah's father, and others. When accusations multiply without corroboration, they don't strengthen a case. They dilute it. Then there's evidentiary ambiguity. Allegations like hit with a phone or chased with a knife sound severe, but severity alone isn't evidence. Courts look for corroboration. Where was the phone? Was there damage? Were there injuries consistent with the claim? Was the knife recovered? Were there fingerprints, witnesses, or video? If those answers aren't clear, prosecutors hesitate, especially in cases where testimony may not be reliable. Now let's address the part people are the angriest about. The no-contact order was lifted. To many viewers, that feels reckless. But procedurally, it's expected. No-contact orders are protective conditions, not punishments. They exist to manage risk while charges are active. Once charges are dismissed, those conditions often dissolve automatically unless a separate civil order exists. That doesn't mean contact is healthy. It doesn't mean it's safe. It means the criminal court no longer has jurisdiction to enforce it, and that distinction matters. Courts don't govern relationships. They govern charges. Which brings us to the frustration about anger management, counseling, or mandated intervention. Those tools require leverage. No conviction, no probation, no conditions. Dismissed cases give judges nothing to enforce. That's why so many people feel like the system did nothing. Because structurally, it can't do anything once a case is dismissed. That doesn't mean behavior is endorsed. It means authority has ended. Now, let's talk about something people keep overlooking. Dismissed cases don't erase police records. Arrests still exist in databases. Incident reports still exist. Statements still exist. And if a similar incident occurs later, history matters. Dismissal is not amnesia, which leads us to Troy's earlier confidence that the charges would be dropped. At the time, many people dismissed that as arrogance or denial. But in hindsight, it may simply reflect an understanding of cooperation dynamics. If he knew he wouldn't testify or wouldn't support the prosecution, that alone could change everything. Again, that doesn't prove anything about what happened. It explains why prosecutors might disengage. Now zoom out again. This dismissal happened quietly. At the same time, a different storyline escalated loudly. Titus's cousin Jamal, someone introduced as part of a controlling dynamic involving Monique, is now reportedly a wanted fugitive. According to circulating information, Jamal has a documented criminal history involving drug trafficking and criminal tools, and he has been out of prison for less than a year. That contrast is jarring. One case evaporates, another ignites. But legally, it makes perfect sense, because the system doesn't react to personalities. It reacts to proof, timing, and thresholds. If Jamal is wanted, it means a judge or agency has determined there is sufficient cause to seek him. That's an active posture. If Zeruiah's charges were dismissed, it means prosecutors decided the opposite posture was warranted for now. Those outcomes don't speak to fairness in the abstract. They speak to feasibility. And that's the hardest thing for viewers to accept. Justice isn't symmetrical. It's procedural. Now, let's address the emotional reaction directly. People feel uneasy because they fear a pattern will repeat. They worry that behavior that looks volatile when unaddressed. They worry that dismissal reinforces it. They worry that consequences never arrive. Those fears aren't irrational. But criminal court is not a preventative system. It's a reactive one. It intervenes after conduct meets prosecutable standards. And when it can't prove that standard, it steps back, even when that feels unsatisfying. Which brings us to the core misunderstanding. Dismissal is not a reward. It's a stop. And stops can be temporary. Cases can be refiled if new evidence emerges. Charges can return if circumstances change. Civil remedies can exist outside criminal court. None of that is visible right now. So at the end of part 2, here's what we actually know. Zeruiah is free because the state chose not to proceed. That choice likely reflects evidence and cooperation issues, not vindication. The no-contact order lifted because the court lost authority. Nothing was proven either way. And at the exact same moment, a different legal situation is unfolding elsewhere, reminding us that the system moves case by case, not story by story. How Titus's cousin went from background player to wanted fugitive, what that status actually means, and why viewers should be careful not to conflate being introduced on a show with being insulated from consequences. Because if there's one consistent rule across all of this, it's this. The law doesn't care how familiar your face is. While one case quietly disappears from the docket, another one snaps into focus, and the contrast is impossible to ignore. Because as Zeruiah walks out of court with her charges dismissed, Jamal is reportedly being sought by authorities. Not rumored, not speculated, wanted. That word has a specific meaning, and it carries more legal weight than anything else we've discussed so far. So before people start weaving theories, let's slow this down and talk about what wanted fugitive actually means, how someone reaches that status, and why this development matters far more than most viewers realize. First, let's clarify Jamal's position in the story. Jamal was introduced early in the current season of Love after lockup as Titus's cousin. He wasn't just a background presence. He was actively involved in a plan to install cameras inside Monique's new home, so Titus could monitor her remotely. That alone raised red flags for viewers, not because it was illegal on its face, but because it demonstrated control, surveillance, and normalization of extreme behavior. During that introduction, Jamal also revealed something important. He had just been released from prison. According to information discussed publicly, Jamal has a documented criminal history that includes multiple arrests related to drug trafficking and possession of criminal tools. He had been out for less than a year. That context matters, because when someone with a recent release history becomes wanted, it usually doesn't happen casually. Now, let's talk about the term itself. A wanted fugitive is not a gossip label. It typically means one of the following has occurred. A judge has issued a warrant for arrest. Probation or parole conditions have been violated and a warrant has followed. New charges have been filed and the individual has failed to appear. Law enforcement has probable cause and is actively seeking the person. In other words, wanted means the system has crossed from observation into action. That's the opposite posture from a dismissed case. And that contrast is critical. In Zeruiah's situation, prosecutors stepped back. In Jamal's situation, authorities appear to be stepping forward. That doesn't make one person morally better or worse than the other. It means the legal thresholds were met in one situation and not in the other. Which brings us to the source of this information. The update about Jamal being wanted has been attributed to online reporting credited to Mary Pan. While full details about the underlying reason for the fugitive status haven't been publicly confirmed yet, the designation itself is not casual. Courts don't label people fugitives lightly. And this is where viewers often misunderstand how quickly things escalate for people with prior supervision. If Jamal was on probation or parole, which is common for recent releases, even a single violation can trigger a warrant. That violation does not need to be a new violent crime. It can involve failure to report, leaving a jurisdiction, associating with prohibited individuals, or engaging in restricted conduct. Those details aren't always public immediately, but once a warrant exists, the status changes. You're no longer under review. You're under pursuit. Now let's connect this to the show itself. Reality TV creates a false sense of insulation. Viewers subconsciously assume that if someone is on a show, their legal issues are being monitored, managed, or softened. That's not true. Production does not shield participants from warrants. Cameras do not pause probation. Contracts do not override court orders. If anything, visibility can accelerate consequences because conduct is documented, public, and harder to deny. So when Jamal appears on screen, discussing surveillance setups, control mechanisms, and involvement in someone else's personal life, that behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. If he was under supervision, everything he did mattered. And if he violated conditions, the response would not be delayed because of television exposure. Now, here's where viewers need to be careful. There is a temptation to connect Jamal's fugitive status to Zeruiah's dismissed case, to see one as proof of systemic bias or inconsistency. But legally, these two situations have almost nothing in common. Zeruiah's case was a prosecutorial decision based on feasibility. Jamal's status is an enforcement decision based on compliance. One is about whether a case can be proven. The other is about whether conditions were violated. They live in different parts of the legal system. And here's the part that complicates public understanding. Probation and parole systems operate with lower thresholds than criminal trials. You don't need proof beyond a reasonable doubt to violate probation. You need reasonable belief that conditions were breached. That means consequences can arrive faster, quieter, and with less explanation, which is why people are often shocked when someone suddenly becomes wanted. From the outside, it feels abrupt. From the inside, it's often the final step of a process that's been unfolding quietly. Now let's talk about what this does to the narrative of the show. Early in the season, Jamal was framed as the enforcer, the one willing to execute Titus's wishes, install cameras, and normalize control over Monique's autonomy. That portrayal felt unsettling to viewers, but now it reads differently. Because when someone with a recent criminal history... Again, this is not a moral conclusion. It's a procedural observation. If Jamal is wanted, authorities have already decided there is enough cause to act. That's not opinion. That's status. And it underscores a broader point. The legal system is not reacting to storylines. It's reacting to conduct. One storyline collapsed because it couldn't be proven. Another escalated because it could be enforced. That difference is uncomfortable, but it's consistent. Now let's address the emotional reaction. People feel whiplash because they expected symmetry. They expected that if one person faced serious allegations, consequences would follow. And if someone else appeared threatening or controlling, consequences would be immediate. But the law does not operate on symmetry. It operates on thresholds. And thresholds are not always visible from the outside. This is why responsible coverage matters. When people say she got away with it, and he's finally being exposed, they are flattening complex legal realities into emotional judgments. And those judgments don't help anyone understand what's actually happening. So where does this leave us? Zeruiah's case ended. For now, because it couldn't proceed. Jamal's situation escalated because it could. Neither outcome confirms a worldview. They confirm procedure. And they remind us of something crucial. Reality TV may frame people as characters, but the law treats them as individuals, each subject to their own records, conditions, and consequences. There is no shared fate, no collective judgment, no narrative balance, just separate cases moving at separate speeds under separate standards. In Part 4, we'll bring all of this together. We'll look at why viewers struggle so much with dismissals and fugitive status happening side by side, how reality TV distorts expectations of justice, and what people should actually take away from seeing one case dissolve while another ignites. Because if there's a lesson here, it's not about who won. It's about understanding how the system really moves, especially when cameras are rolling. What makes this moment so volatile isn't just what happened. It's how uneven it feels. One person walks out of court with charges dismissed, no conditions, no mandated counseling, no visible consequence. At the same time, another person connected to the same television universe is suddenly labeled a wanted fugitive. To a viewer, that feels backward, unfair, almost mocking, and that reaction makes sense emotionally, but it collapses once you step into how the legal system actually functions. Because the justice system is not built to feel balanced. It is built to be defensible. And those are not the same thing. Let's start with the expectation that's driving most of the outrage. People expect symmetry. If two situations look equally bad, people expect equally serious consequences. If someone behaves aggressively on camera, people expect accountability off camera. If one storyline explodes publicly, people expect the law to follow that same arc. Reality TV quietly trains viewers to believe this. Shows like Love After Lockup are structured around escalation and payoff. Bad behavior leads to confrontation. Conflict leads to consequences. Every episode teaches the same lesson. Actions trigger reactions. But the legal system doesn't operate on narrative logic. It operates on thresholds. And thresholds don't care how things look. They care about what can be proven, enforced, or compelled under law. That's why this feels wrong, not because the system broke, but because it never promised what viewers think it did. Let's break this apart cleanly. Zeruiah's case did not end because the court decided she was innocent. It ended because the prosecution decided it could not proceed. That distinction is everything. Criminal court is not a moral court. It does not exist to validate public discomfort or intervene in dysfunctional relationships unless specific legal standards are met. When those standards collapse, because witnesses won't testify, evidence doesn't align, or narratives conflict, the court loses its authority to act. When that happens, the system doesn't choose mercy. It loses jurisdiction. And once jurisdiction is gone, so are tools like no-contact orders, mandatory counseling, or anger management requirements. Those are enforcement mechanisms, not therapeutic offerings. They only exist when charges exist. This is where people feel betrayed, because they didn't want punishment for punishment's sake. They wanted interruption. They wanted something to stop a pattern. But criminal court is not a preventative system. It does not exist to manage future risk unless it can first prove past conduct beyond a legal threshold. When it can't, it steps back, even if that feels dangerous or irresponsible from the outside. Now contrast that with Jamal's situation. His escalation did not come from public outrage. It came from compliance failure. Becoming a wanted fugitive is not about how someone is perceived. It's about whether a court order was violated, a warrant was issued, or supervision conditions were breached. That process is mechanical. If you are under supervision, the system does not wait for optics. It does not negotiate with narratives. It enforces conditions. That's why Jamal's situation moved fast, and why it feels sudden. From the outside, viewers didn't see the steps leading there. They didn't see missed check-ins, possible violations, or paperwork moving behind the scenes. They only see the final label, wanted. That gap between unseen process and visible outcome is what creates shock, and that shock gets misinterpreted as injustice. But legally, these two outcomes aren't connected at all. One is about proof. The other is about compliance. One fails when evidence is insufficient. The other activates when rules are broken. Different lanes, different standards, different consequences. The system didn't contradict itself. It applied itself separately. Now, let's address the hardest part of this conversation. The feeling that someone got away with it. That phrase carries emotional weight, but legally it's meaningless. No conviction does not mean no harm. No charges does not mean no wrongdoing. It means no adjudication occurred. And that's deeply uncomfortable, because it leaves things unresolved. But unresolved does not equal unjust. It equals unproven. And here's where reality TV distorts expectations further. On television, behavior is curated, edited, sequenced. Viewers see escalation without seeing context, and they see aftermath without seeing legal limitations. That creates a false belief that visibility equals accountability. In reality, visibility can do the opposite. High-profile cases make prosecutors more cautious, not less. They raise the cost of mistakes. They amplify defense strategies. They increase scrutiny, which means prosecutors often narrow cases instead of expanding them, or drop them entirely if the risk of failure outweighs the likelihood of success. That's not corruption. That's risk assessment. Now, let's talk about why people wanted something to happen, even if charges were dismissed. Because at the center of this reaction isn't vengeance. It's fear. People are afraid patterns will repeat. They're afraid volatile behavior will escalate. They're afraid dismissal sends a message of permission. Those fears are real, but criminal court is not designed to address them directly. There are other systems that do that. Civil court, family court, therapeutic intervention, community accountability. But criminal court only steps in when conduct crosses a provable legal line. And when it can't prove that crossing, it steps back, regardless of how uneasy that feels. This is where the disconnect becomes permanent for many viewers. They expect the law to act like a guardian, but it acts like an arbiter. Guardians prevent harm. Arbiters judge claims, and arbiters require proof. Which brings us to the final, uncomfortable truth of this story. Justice is not symmetrical. It is individualized. Each person is evaluated on their own conduct, their own record, their own evidence, and their own legal exposure. There is no shared reckoning, no balancing of scales between cast members, no narrative fairness. That's why one person can walk free while another becomes wanted, even when both exist in the same televised world. Reality TV encourages moral accounting. The law rejects it, and that rejection is what feels so wrong. But it's also what prevents the system from becoming arbitrary. So here's how this script ends. Not with certainty, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Zeruiah's case ended because the state could not move forward. That does not mean the behavior was endorsed. It means the burden of proof could not be met. Jamal's situation escalated because enforcement thresholds were crossed. That does not mean he was targeted. It means supervision rules were applied. Neither outcome tells a complete moral story. Both outcomes tell a procedural one. And that's the part viewers struggle to accept, because procedure doesn't care how things feel. It only cares how they can be defended. So if this moment feels unsettling, that's because unresolved situations always are. But unresolved does not mean ignored, and quiet does not mean over. It means the system has reached the edge of what it can legally do and stopped there. Not because it failed, but because that's where its authority ends. And that's the truth this story leaves us with. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.